Inc. 4 Internal Audit, Interview Preparation. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into internal audit interview prep used across Big Four advisory and global capability centers. These questions reflect real patterns used in internal audit, risk advisory, and SOX-linked audit teams. Internal audit focuses on evaluating risk, strengthening controls, improving processes, and enhancing governance, not just finding issues. Let's begin. How do you determine the audit universe and prioritize areas for the annual internal audit plan? Sample answer. I start by mapping all business processes, entities, and risk areas into the audit universe. Then, I evaluate each area's inherent risk, control maturity, financial exposure, compliance requirements, and past audit issues. High-risk and regulatory-heavy areas get priority. I also align with management's risk appetite before finalizing the annual plan. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A business unit reports consistently high profits. What red flags would you evaluate during internal audit? Sample answer. I look for margin inflation, aggressive revenue recognition, under-provisioning, inventory valuation issues, or unrecorded liabilities. I compare KPIs with operational data and industry benchmarks to test whether the performance is genuine or engineered. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you perform a risk assessment for a newly formed entity with no audit history? Sample answer. I conduct stakeholder interviews, review policies, map key processes, evaluate governance structure, and identify operational, compliance, and financial risks. I use qualitative scoring since historical data is limited. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A process owner is uncooperative and refuses to share data. How do you continue the audit? Sample answer. I remain professional, escalate gently to the functional head, and reiterate audit scope and confidentiality safeguards. If resistance continues, I inform the CAE and document all interactions. The audit continues based on available data and alternate procedures. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you evaluate design versus operating effectiveness of internal controls? Sample answer. Design effectiveness checks whether the control addresses the risk. Operating effectiveness checks whether it is performed consistently. I validate through walkthroughs, inquiry, observation, inspection, and reperformance. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A company recently implemented a new ERP. What key areas do you focus on during post-implementation review? Sample answer. I assess data migration accuracy, user access provisioning, SOTI conflicts, configuration settings, interface controls, and completeness of training. I also test whether manual workarounds still exist. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you identify and evaluate key risks during process walkthroughs? Sample answer. I map process flows end to end, understand handoffs, identify failure points, evaluate control placement, and compare the design with best practices. Any high-risk gaps form part of the audit plan. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A control is documented but not followed consistently across locations. How do you assess this? Sample answer. I test multiple locations, compare control execution frequency, review local SOPs, and evaluate whether the inconsistency increases risk exposure. This usually results in a design or operating effectiveness gap. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you test for fraud indicators in procurement and vendor management? Sample answer. I use data analytics to detect unusual pricing, duplicate vendors, round sum payments, split POs, and abnormal approvals. I also review conflicts of interest and vendor onboarding controls. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A company allows manual overrides for urgent transactions. How do you evaluate associated risks? Sample answer. I assess how frequently overrides occur, who approves them, and whether logs exist. High overrides indicate poor control discipline, so I test compensating controls like post-review monitoring. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you plan and execute a surprise audit? Sample answer. I keep the scope confidential, coordinate only with the CAE, visit the location unannounced, perform cash checks, inventory counts, access reviews, and transaction sampling. I document exceptions immediately. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A process has no documented SOPs. How do you perform the audit? Sample answer. I interview process owners, map actual practices, identify informal controls, and compare them with expected best practices. Lack of SOPs itself becomes an audit finding. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you evaluate adequacy of segregation of duties (SOD) in finance and procurement? Sample answer. I test access rights, conflicting roles, example, vendor creation and payment, and compensating controls. I use SOD matrices and system access logs to validate. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you prioritize issues identified during an audit? Sample answer. I assess impact, likelihood, financial exposure, compliance implications, and control maturity. Critical issues affecting financial reporting or fraud risk get escalated first. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A business reports abnormal inventory shrinkage. How do you investigate? Sample answer. I review stock counts, warehouse security, access logs, scrap approvals, and movement registers. I test shrinkage patterns by product, location, and employee shifts. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you audit shared service centers supporting multi-country operations? Sample answer. I review SLAs, process maps, KPIs, SOD, ticketing systems, and accuracy of reconciliations. I also test cross-country compliance and data security. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you test effectiveness of whistleblower mechanisms? Sample answer. I review hotline usage data, independence of investigation teams, escalation timelines, and employee awareness. I validate whether issues raised resulted in action. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A company uses spreadsheets for critical operations. How do you assess spreadsheet risks? Sample answer. I check access controls, change logs, formula integrity, versioning, and linkage to source systems. Critical spreadsheets require maker-checker controls. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you evaluate ICFR, SOX ICFR within internal audit? Sample answer. I identify key controls related to financial reporting, test design, and operating effectiveness. Validate evidence and assess whether deficiencies impact material misstatement risk. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you validate completeness and accuracy of data used in analytical reviews? Sample answer. I obtain data from system of record sources, reconcile sample outputs to source documents, and test for missing or duplicate entries. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A key control is missing. How do you report this to management? Sample answer. I explain the risk clearly, show process gaps, provide examples of potential impact, and recommend practical control solutions. Missing controls typically lead to high severity findings. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you evaluate cyber and information security risks during internal audit? Sample answer. I review access controls, patching status, vulnerability reports, backups, and incident response processes. If needed, I coordinate with IT or cybersecurity specialists. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you test logical access controls for critical systems? Sample answer. I test user provisioning, deprovisioning, privileged access, SOD conflicts, and periodic access review documentation. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A company faces backlog in bank reconciliations. What procedures do you perform? Sample answer. I assess the age of unreconciled items, test clearing patterns, identify root causes, example, staffing, system issues, and evaluate whether financial misstatements may exist. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you evaluate third-party vendor risks during internal audit? Sample answer. I review due diligence files, contracts, performance metrics, onboarding controls, and payments for anomalies. High-risk vendors require deeper sampling and conflict checks. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A company uses multiple outsourcing partners. How do you assess internal controls placed over outsourced processes? Sample answer. I review SLAs, process ownership, data flows, SOD matrix, and reliance on SOC1 reports. I test monitoring controls performed by the company to ensure outsourced activities operate as expected. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you audit business continuity and disaster recovery processes? Sample answer. I assess BCP documentation, RTO, RPO definitions, DR test results, backup integrity, and crisis escalation protocols. I also evaluate whether roles and responsibilities are clearly assigned and practiced. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A high-value contract is awarded to a new vendor. What validation steps do you perform? Sample answer. I review vendor onboarding documentation, pricing evaluation, conflict checks, approval workflow, and benchmark pricing. I also test whether purchase aligns with procurement policy. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you assess compliance with internal policies and regulatory requirements? Sample answer. I compare actual processes with policy requirements, test a sample of transactions for compliance, assess awareness levels, and identify outdated or unclear sections needing update. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A recurring audit issue hasn't been resolved for 3 years. How do you escalate it? Sample answer. I reassess the risk impact, highlight repeated non-compliance in the report, and escalate to senior management or the audit committee. Chronic issues often signal culture or ownership gaps. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you validate internal controls around revenue leakage? Sample answer. I test contract terms, pricing controls, credit notes, discount approvals, and reconciliations between operational and financial systems. Data analytics helps identify leakages across SKUs and customers. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you perform data analytics to detect anomalies or outliers? Sample answer. I extract system-level data, clean and validate it, then run logic-based tests such as duplicate entries, trend deviations, Benford's Law, and threshold breaches to spot anomalies for deeper testing. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A company has weak password controls. What are the risks, and how do you report them? Sample answer. Risks include unauthorized access, fraud, and system manipulation. I test password settings, review policy gaps, benchmark against standards, and issue a finding with remediation actions. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you assess effectiveness of internal audit follow-up and remediation tracking? Sample answer. I review remediation plans, due dates, ownership, and evidence submitted. I validate closure by retesting controls, not just relying on self-reported updates. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A business handles high-volume transactions with few checks. How do you focus your testing? Sample answer. I identify high-risk steps, perform sample-based testing using analytics, review exception logs, and evaluate whether automated controls can replace missing manual checks. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you evaluate adequacy of risk management frameworks? Sample answer. I assess risk identification, scoring methodology, ownership, KRI reporting, and linkage to strategy. Weak frameworks often lack accountability or timely escalation. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A sudden spike in employee reimbursements is noticed. How do you investigate? Sample answer. I analyze reimbursement trends, test supporting bills, check duplicate submissions, assess approval controls, and test for policy misuse or fraud indicators. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you audit payroll processes in a large organization? Sample answer. I test hiring to exit controls, SOD between HR and payroll, reconciliations, access rights, overtime approvals, and sample test payroll calculations for accuracy. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A company has frequent manual journal entries. How do you assess risks associated with them? Sample answer. I test authorization, documentation quality, posting patterns, cutoff timing, and access rights. Manual entries are a high fraud risk, so precision of review controls is crucial. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you evaluate end-to-end controls for order-to-cash O2C processes? Sample answer. I assess customer onboarding, credit checks, order approvals, dispatch controls, invoicing accuracy, collections, and write-off approvals. Weakness in any step affects revenue integrity. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you assess ITGCs in an internal audit? Sample answer. I evaluate access controls, change management, backup/DR, and IT operations. ITGC failures affect reliability of automated controls, so I test both design and operating effectiveness. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you audit fixed asset management across dispersed locations? Sample answer. I perform physical verification sampling, review asset tagging, disposal approvals, CWIP movement, and capitalization policies. I also reconcile FAR with GL. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you evaluate internal controls in a rapidly scaling startup? Sample answer. I assess governance maturity, informal practices, reliance on spreadsheets, SOD gaps, and process scalability. Startups often need pragmatic, risk-based controls rather than heavy frameworks. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A company has recurring compliance fines. How do you assess root causes? Sample answer. I review compliance ownership, regulatory monitoring processes, documentation quality, filing timelines, and competence of responsible teams. Recurrence signals systemic control failure. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you evaluate procurement-to-pay P2P controls for high-risk vendors? Sample answer. I test vendor onboarding checks, pricing approvals, PO/GRN invoice matching, conflict of interest declarations, and payment controls. High-risk vendors require enhanced scrutiny. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A process has multiple exceptions to workflow approvals. How do you test effectiveness? Sample answer. I analyze exception logs, understand reasons, test whether approvals are documented, and assess whether exceptions dilute control effectiveness. High exceptions often mean poor process discipline. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you evaluate tone at the top and governance culture? Sample answer. I assess leadership communication, whistleblower trends, incident response, policy enforcement consistency, and ethical behavior at senior levels. Culture drives control maturity. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. A critical observation may impact audit rating. How do you communicate it? Sample answer. I brief senior stakeholders early, explain the risk in clear terms, provide supporting evidence, and discuss practical remediation. No surprises at reporting stage is key. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. How do you conduct a thematic audit focused solely on fraud risks? Sample answer. I define fraud scenarios, test red flag indicators, run analytics, review controls around procurement, payroll, O2C, and approvals, and interview key stakeholders. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation, etc. How do you prepare and present an internal audit report to the audit committee? Sample answer. I summarize key risks, high priority findings, root causes, business impact, and agreed remediation timelines. I keep the report concise, data-backed, and aligned to governance expectations. While answering, always talk about risk prioritization, control design, evidence, documentation. Thank you for watching, and if you liked our video, kindly press the like button and leave us a comment. This will help us reach a wider audience. Don't forget to check the playlist for more great learning.